Dvorak's Third and Fourth Symphonies, much like Beethoven's Fifth and Sixth Symphonies, are very much pendants to each other. He wrote them at almost exactly the same time, around 1873, when Dvorak's fortunes were finally, as a truly struggling young artist, a struggling young composer, his fortunes were finally beginning to turn. He had moved to Prague as a penniless young musician from a Bohemian village where his father was the local innkeeper. He had moved to Prague in the late 1850s, spent the 1860s mainly writing chamber music, which stood him in very good stead for his gradual. I mean, basically, you have to realize that not unlike Brahms, Dvorak, his great German contemporary, Dvorak was a basically self-taught composer. Sir Edward Elgar was the same way. Back in those days, you really learned by doing. And Dvorak was, to put it mildly, no exception. He spent his 20s and early 30s in the 1860s, again, just mainly writing chamber music, which taught him so much because it taught him how to rein in his impulses, to discipline his incredibly kind of over fertile talent for writing melodies. And it also gained him a small but devoted following in the musical circles of his great national capital of Bohemia. Of course, I'm referring to Prague, with its great musical traditions going back to the late Middle Ages. So Dvorak learns by doing, spending the 1860s mainly writing chamber music, but of course he's not making any money doing it. He's just barely getting by, taking whatever gig he can get as a freelance viola player, and a quite talented one at that. He played in both of the opera pit orchestras of Prague, the National Theater, which of course at that point, Bohemia, the Kingdom of Bohemia, was still very much part of the Austrian Habsburg Empire, so the National Theater presented its operas in German, but he also played at the newly established Provisional Theater, where many of the operas were done actually in Czech, and a whole new national school of opera was burgeoning, mainly by way of Dvorak's colleague who was 17 years his senior, the great composer and conductor Bedřich Smetana, who conducted the orchestra of the Provisional Theater and who left us that towering cycle of tone poems called Ma Vlast, my homeland, which hopefully we'll do someday together in La Crosse. Well, Dvorak is making his living as a viola player and by teaching here and there, and in his spare time sharing this apartment with, 3 or 4 other musicians, he writes all this chamber music. So by the time he gets to his third symphony, because by the early 1870s, he hasn't written a symphony for 10 years, which was a good thing, because his first 2 symphonies, while, again, this rich kind of cornucopia of melodic output, beautiful ideas, has a pronounced lack of organizational skill. And those first 2 symphonies are really best left to the diehards, the connoisseurs. But here we are in the early 1870s, and Dvorak is finally finding his footing as a symphonist, as a composer of symphonies. He also gets married at this time. Much like his idol Mozart, he has been rebuffed by a beautiful young lady, so he, several years later, marries that woman's sister. It was a very happy and contented marriage. So Dvorak is beginning to find his footing as artist and man. And in 1873, he writes that gorgeous Symphony No. 3, which we experienced together last time. And then soon after, minutes after completing that, he really concurrently is working on his Symphony No. 4 in D minor, a very much the sister work to the Symphony No. 3, but these are not twin sisters at all. Otherwise very different work. Whereas the Third Symphony in that glorious, heroic key of E-flat major, remember E-flat is the key of Beethoven's Eroica Symphony, where the Symphony No. 3 was gorgeous, glorious, broadly expansive, gently lyrical in tone. The Symphony Number 4 is brittle, tragic, dramatic, and most of all, concise. It is everything. Dvorak, in his writing his fourth symphony, because his third symphony, as you will know from last time, his third symphony was almost unique in that it was in three broad movements, three large movements that were almost really symphonic poems unto themselves. With the Symphony Number 4, he returns to the traditional four-movement structure that he had written in his first and second symphonies. But it is as if with his fourth symphony, Dvorak is bound and determined to make none of the mistakes he made in his Symphony Number 2. It is tightly organized, almost to the point of ruthlessness. In fact, the first movement in particular, I wish were longer, because the melodies, the three melodies that he presents very clearly, kind of ABC, in the first movement's sonata allegro form, are so absolutely beautiful and effective. The first idea, in which I think the influence of that other great towering romantic composer and all-round musician of the mid-19th century, I think here the music of Franz Liszt is a profound influence on him. The second theme is the opposite of the first. It's just warmly lyrical and just broad-arched, long-limbed melody, and you almost wish he had spent more time luxuriating in those gorgeous tunes, but he does not. He keeps moving, and again, it's a very tightly packed sonata allegro form. The slow movement is a surprise. Here we have a seamless series of a theme and 5 variations, in which the variations are so beautifully wrought together, so seamlessly wrought together that you literally are liable to lose track of where one variation ends and the next one begins. It feels more like a kind of just a stream of consciousness kind of thing, this second movement, this slow movement. The theme of this set of theme and variations is a theme that Dvorak is consciously signaling to be very much modeled on the opening of the overture to Richard Wagner's opera Tannhäuser. And again, Dvorak knows exactly what he's doing. He knows that his audience is going to go, aha, the moment they hear it, because this is the 1870s, and of course everyone knows their Wagner operas. And it was Wagner himself, remember, who 10 years before had come to Prague to conduct the orchestra of the National Theatre in an orchestral concert. And Dvorak lucked out and got himself hired to play in the viola section. And it was an experience in Dvorak's life which he truly never forgot. It made an indelible impression on him. And one of the works that Wagner had conducted on that special concert was his overture to his very famous, even then, kind of blockbuster hit of an opera, Tannhäuser. So Dvorak, again, the way I've been talking about how composers make signals to their audiences, Dvorak is here signaling that this slow movement will be this meditation on the atmosphere of the Tannhäuser overture. And then you get this series of variations in which, in the variations, Dvorak instantly declares himself to be his own man, because the variations are absolutely in his own lyrical Czech national style. They don't sound like Wagner at all. And the harmonies get so gloriously dense, and they're very much influenced by folk music of the period. They're almost kind of blue note sounds that remind you of like Duke Ellington and George Gershwin, 75 years later. It's an amazing kind of unique creation, this slow movement of a theme and variations that builds and builds to a climax and then finally kind of comes to a gentle close. The third movement, again, Dvorak here reverts to the typical four-movement style of a symphony. So the third movement is a scherzo. It is a wild, almost violent one in tone, back in the symphony's home key of D minor. The trio section, of course, the scherzo is in an A-B-A form, scherzo, trio, scherzo. The trio is this amazing musical moment where there's this festive march that starts off in the distance, and the military band is coming towards us in full bloom musically, their glorious tune, and then they go away. And in the best, this is martial music in the best sense, and it becomes joyously festive. It's like a victorious army returning home from battle. The fourth movement, Dvorak brings it all together in a movement that has this kind of stomping folk dance. It's in duple time, 2/4 time, and it's this kind of, it's based on this again, there's nothing Wagnerian or Lisztian about this. This is Bohemian music to its core. And there's this kind of very kind of tribalistic kind of stomping idea that is the basis of the finale. And here again, remember with the third symphony, he basically bases an entire finale on one idea. He does that here too, but here we are blessed with as the subsidiary theme, we are blessed with yet another of those gorgeous arching melodies, as only Dvorak really could write. It's all brought together in this glorious peroration, and it's one of the greatest endings of any Dvorak symphony I know. Like the third symphony, again, I don't say this to be cute, its total neglect in the modern orchestral scene is something I do not understand. But I hope you will end up sharing my great love and enthusiasm for this youthful but mature Symphony No. 4 in D minor of Dvorak.